The sound that woke me was not thunder. I had learned, after 3 years of carrying trays through the great hall of Castle Varenhold, to tell the difference between a storm rolling in from the eastern mountains and the kind of silence that comes just before something breaks. That morning, before the first candle had been lit in the servants' corridor, I heard it, a stillness so complete that even the mice in the walls seemed to hold their breath. I sat up on my narrow cot, the rough linen scratching my arms, and listened. Nothing. And then, distant, muffled by stone, the low bark of a war horn. My name is Annie, and I am an Omega. That is the first thing anyone notices about me, before my pale blonde braid. Before my gray cloak that has been mended so many times the stitches form their own map across the wool, before the faint rose color that creeps into my cheeks whenever I'm embarrassed or afraid. My rank comes off me the way wood smoke clings to cloth. You cannot wash it out. In the hierarchy of Varenhold, Omegas carry trays and mop hearthstones and lower their eyes when alphas pass through doorways. We do not ask questions. We do not linger in corridors. We certainly do not listen at walls when war horns sound before dawn. I listened anyway. By the time I had dressed and tied my braid and slipped into the servants' passage behind the great kitchen, the castle had already begun to wake in the particular way it woke when something was wrong. Not with noise, but with movement. Guards walking faster than usual. The head steward, Lord Kale, moving through the corridor with a torch, and no explanation. His jaw set like iron. 2 of the senior beta warriors buckling their chest plates in the yard below the window I passed, their breath rising in white clouds against the gray dawn. I kept my head down and carried my tray. Breakfast for the eastern wing still had to be served. Whatever was happening beyond the walls, the castle's 100 residents still needed bread and warm broth, and the task would fall to whoever was available. That morning, I was available. I was always available. My presence was convenient when work needed doing, and invisible when anything more important was happening. The eastern wing was where the visiting lords slept during the autumn council. 5 days of meetings during which the 5 great alpha lords of the surrounding territories rode into Varenhold and sat around King Theron's war table and argued about borders and tribute and alliances, while their retinues drank the castle's ale and looked down at the servants with the casual contempt of men who have never considered that the floor they walk on had to be swept. The 5 lords were Lord Devon of the Ironwood, a broad man with a red beard who laughed too loudly and whose laughter never reached his eyes. Lord Saren of the Ashven, pale and thin and always cold, even in summer, who watched everything from beneath half-lowered lids. Lady Mora of the Crestfall, the only woman among the 5, hard as the cliffs her territory was named for, with silver-streaked black hair and a reputation that made even seasoned warriors careful with their words around her. Lord Pell of the Dunmarch, young, ambitious, and with the kind of smile that meant he was counting something. And Lord Hadrick of the Grey Vale, oldest of the 5, whose quiet voice carried more weight than any of the others shouting. I had been serving all 5 of them for 4 days. I knew which lord took his broth without salt, which one demanded a second cup of spiced cider before he would speak a word to anyone, and which one was more interested in watching the door than eating anything at all. Lord Pell. Lord Pell always watched the door. I was setting down a clay pitcher on the sideboard outside the great hall when I heard the argument. Not an argument. That word is too small. What came through the thick oak door was a war. You have no authority to demand... Authority? That voice I recognized even through wood and stone. King Theron. His voice was like the lowest string of a war drum, resonant and final, and not accustomed to being interrupted. I am Alpha King of Varenhold. Every stone of this castle is my authority. Then, perhaps, and this was Lord Pell, smooth and precise as a drawn blade, you should have used that authority to meet the terms we agreed upon 6 months ago. A silence. Then, what terms? The ones you signed. Lord Davon now, with that hollow laugh of his stripped away entirely, leaving something harder underneath. The ones that bound you to a trade agreement, that benefits all 5 territories and costs your crown nothing except the pride of admitting that Varenhold cannot stand alone, I should have walked away. I should have taken my tray and my pitcher and gone back to the kitchen and pretended I had heard nothing, because that was the correct behavior for an Omega servant, and it was the behavior that kept me employed and housed and fed. And those 3 things were not small things when you had grown up with none of them guaranteed. I did not walk away. I pressed my back against the cold stone beside the door, and I breathed very quietly, and I listened, because something in the quality of the silence on the other side of that door felt the way the air feels before lightning strikes, charged and not yet finished. "You brought weapons into my council chamber," Theron said, and his voice was so controlled it was frightening. 5 Alpha Lords, and each of you brought more armed men into my keep than the Treaty of the Autumn Council permits. I noticed. I have always noticed. The question I have been asking myself for 4 days is why? Another silence. Longer. Then Lady Mora's voice, low and clear. "Because some decisions require certainty." The door burst open. I stumbled back against the opposite wall, nearly dropping the pitcher, and the 5 lords came through the doorway together. Not fleeing, not rushing, but moving with the coordinated purpose of people who have rehearsed this. And behind them, in the great hall, I heard the scrape of boots on stone and the unmistakable sound of swords leaving their scabbards. King Theron stood in the center of the hall. He was taller than I remembered from the times I had glimpsed him at a distance, broad across the shoulders, wearing his battle leather with the dark fur mantle even inside the castle, his black hair pulled back in long braids that fell to his collar, his blue eyes so pale they were almost silver. There was a thin scar along his left jaw that I had never noticed before, and there was blood on his right forearm. Not much, but fresh. He was alone. Every one of his own guards had been drawn away, I realized with a cold and plummeting certainty. That was what the war horn had been. A diversion. 5 rival Alpha Lords and their combined retinues, filling the great hall, and one king standing among them with his hands open at his sides, and his chin raised and his expression so utterly without fear that for a moment I forgot to breathe. And then Lord Pell drew his sword and pointed it at Theron's chest. "Abdicate," he said pleasantly. "Or don't. It changes very little at this point." I was still holding the pitcher. I do not know what came over me in that moment. I am not a warrior. I have no wolf form trained for battle, no alpha strength, no weapon except the small knife I used to cut bread at the kitchen table. I am an Omega who carries trays and keeps her eyes down, and has learned very thoroughly how to make herself small. But there was something I had that none of the men in that hall were thinking about. I had spent 3 years moving through Castle Varenhold unseen. I knew every passage, every hidden door behind every tapestry, every speaking tube built into the old stone walls by the castle's founders, the hollow channels that ran between chambers and could carry a whisper from the great hall to the garrison tower faster than any messenger could run. I knew where the nearest one was. I had cleaned its grate 100 times. It was 6 steps to my left, behind a worn tapestry of a stag hunt, and if I put my mouth to it and called clearly enough, my voice would travel directly to the garrison captain's chamber, where Theron's personal guard would be gathered, confused by the false alarm that had drawn them outside. 6 steps. I looked at the king, standing alone among his enemies, and I made my choice. I set down the pitcher without a sound, and I moved. 6 steps had never felt so long. The tapestry was rough under my fingertips, old wool, stiff with decades of smoke and dust, and I pushed behind it with my shoulder, pressing myself into the narrow gap between the fabric and the stone wall. And I did not look back at the hall. I could not afford to look back. If I looked back and saw the sword still pointed at Theron's chest, I would lose whatever strange and reckless courage had carried me this far. The speaking tube grate was exactly where I knew it would be. Cold iron, set flush into the stone, barely wider than my palm. I pressed my lips close to it and breathed in first, tasted dust, and the faint mineral cold of deep stone. And then I spoke. Not loudly. Loudly would carry back into the hall. The speaking tubes were designed to amplify, not to require volume. The castle's old builders had understood acoustics the way they understood everything. Practically, quietly, and with an eye toward situations exactly like this one. "Garrison captain," I said, my voice barely above a breath. "The Great Hall. The king is alone. Armed men, the Lord's retinues, go now. Use the north passage. Do not use the main corridor." A pause. I pressed my ear to the grate. Nothing. Then, faint, unmistakable. The sound of boots. Many boots, moving fast. I let out a breath so carefully it barely stirred the air. Then I heard from the hall, Lord Devon's voice raised in the beginning of a threat. And underneath it, King Theron's voice, still that low drumbeat of absolute composure. "Before you finish that sentence, Lord Davin, consider whether you have accounted for every passage in this castle." A pause. "I have lived here," Theron continued, "since I was 8 years old. I know things about these walls that are not written in any map. I heard very faintly, from the direction of the north passage, the one that entered the great hall through a servant's door behind the far hearth, the soft, controlled sound of the garrison entering position. And then, everything happened at once. I did not see the confrontation directly. I heard it through the tapestry and the stone. The garrison captain's voice raised in command, the clatter of the Lord's retinues being surrounded, the short and ugly sounds of men who had been caught deciding quickly whether to fight or surrender. Most of them chose surrender. Whatever plan the 5 lords had brought into Varenhold that morning, it had depended entirely on Theron being isolated, and Theron was no longer isolated. When I finally stepped out from behind the tapestry, still clutching the edge of it with both hands, because my knees were less steady than I would have liked, the hall had been transformed. The lords' retinues were disarmed, kneeling in a line along the eastern wall, with the garrison's spears at their backs. The 5 lords themselves stood together in the center of the room. Lord Pell's sword was gone, and for the first time in 4 days, his pleasant smile was entirely absent. Lady Mora had her chin raised with the particular dignity of someone who has lost, but will not show it. Lord Hadrick simply looked old and tired, and I thought, looking at him, that he was perhaps the only one who had not wanted this. King Theron stood near the great hearth. He was not injured beyond the cut on his forearm, which he had wrapped loosely in a strip of cloth someone had provided. Not neatly, the way a proper healer would bind it, but functionally, the way a man who does not want to stop moving does it himself. He was speaking in low, rapid sentences to his garrison captain, a grizzled beta named Corvin, whom I had occasionally encountered in the kitchen corridor demanding extra bread for the night watch. Corvin was nodding, his expression grim and focused. I should have left. I should have retrieved my pitcher, returned to the kitchen, told no one what I had done, and let the morning continue as though I had never stepped out of my designated role in the order of things. That would have been sensible. That would have been safe. But I had set my pitcher down 6 steps from a speaking tube and breathed a warning into stone, and the garrison had come, and the king was still standing. My legs carried me 3 more steps into the hall before my common sense caught up with me and stopped me. Too late. Theron turned. I do not know what I expected from the Alpha King's gaze. I had spent 3 years perfecting the art of not meeting it. I expected something cold, or distant, or the blank imperious look that powerful men sometimes gave servants when they registered their existence for the first time. I expected to be looked through. Instead, he looked at me. Not at the space around me. Not at the approximate area where a servant was standing. At me. At my face. At the way I was holding the edge of my gray cloak in both hands without realizing it. At whatever expression I was wearing, which I suspected was something between determined and terrified. "You," he said, not unkindly. More like a man identifying a sound he had heard and was now placing a source to. "She was behind the tapestry," Corvin said without any particular inflection. He had clearly noticed me already. "Near the stag hunt." "The speaking tube," Theron said. It was not a question. He was looking at me steadily, those pale eyes assessing and precise, and I felt the particular discomfort of being seen by someone who was genuinely paying attention. That was you. I opened my mouth, closed it, reminded myself that I was an Omega servant, and that the appropriate response to a direct statement from the Alpha King was either confirmation or silence. Yes, my lord, I said. A pause. Your name. Annie, my lord. I served the Eastern Wing during the Autumn Council. He studied me for a moment in a way that made me want to step backward, not because it was threatening, but because it was thorough. He was cataloging something, and I did not know what. How did you know which tube to use? He asked. The passages aren't marked. I clean them, my lord, I said. The grates collect dust. I clean them every fortnight. I know where each one leads. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, not yet, but a kind of adjustment. The way a man recalculates a distance when he realizes he has misread the map. Everyone? He said. Yes, my lord. Behind him, Lord Pell made a sound. Not quite a laugh, but something sharp and contemptuous and aimed at me. An Omega serving girl, he said. That is what undid 5 years of planning. An Omega with a mop and a good memory. The hall was very quiet. I kept my eyes on Theron, because looking at Pell felt dangerous in a way I could not entirely explain, and also because Theron was the one whose reaction mattered. The king did not look at Pell. He continued looking at me. You could have stayed in the corridor, he said. It was not a reproach. It sounded almost like a question, the kind a person asks when they are genuinely curious about the answer. Yes, my lord. Why didn't you? I thought about it honestly for a moment, because he deserved an honest answer, and because something in his directness made dishonesty feel pointless. It seemed like a waste, I said carefully, to know something useful and not use it. The ghost of something, not quite a smile, but the territory a smile might eventually occupy, crossed his face and disappeared. Take her to the East Solar, he said to Corvin, without looking away from me. Give her something to eat. I want to speak with her before the midday bell. Corvin nodded. He glanced at me with the mild curiosity of a man who has seen strange things and has learned to reserve judgment. I followed him out of the hall, and behind me I heard the 5 lords being escorted in a different direction entirely, their footsteps heavier than they had been when they arrived, weighted down by the morning's failure and whatever would come next. The East Solar was a room I had cleaned many times, but never occupied as anything other than a servant passing through. It was smaller than the great hall by a great measure, but warmer. 2 hearths, tapestries on all 4 walls to keep the heat in, a long table of dark oak, and tall leaded windows that looked out over the castle's inner yard. Morning light came through them in long, flat columns, catching the dust in the air and making it look, briefly, like something precious. A young Beta woman named Sela, one of the castle's kitchen workers whose path crossed mine often, brought bread and a bowl of stew and set it in front of me with a look that was half sympathy and half pure astonishment. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I used a speaking tube," I said. "Annie," she glanced at the door. "Half the castle is talking. They're saying you called the garrison yourself, that you were in the hall when the lords—" "I was in the corridor," I said. "I had the breakfast tray." She stared at me. "Eat your stew," she said finally, which was not an answer to anything but seemed to be all she had. I ate the stew. It was good. Thyme and root vegetables. The way the head cook made it when there was enough to be generous. And I made myself eat slowly, because my hands were trembling slightly, and I did not want them to be trembling when the king came to speak with me. Outside the window, I could see the inner yard. The false alarm that had drawn the garrison out had been caused by a fire in the hay barn near the eastern gate. Contained now, smoking gently in the morning light. 2 stable hands throwing buckets of water at the last of it. A diversion, just as I had thought. Coordinated. Deliberate. 5 years of planning, Pell had said. 5 years. I thought about that, turning my bread over in my hands. 5 years of maneuvering, of orchestrating, of waiting for precisely the right moment during precisely the right gathering. And it had come apart because an Omega who cleaned speaking tube grates every fortnight had been carrying a breakfast tray down the wrong corridor at the wrong time. Or the right time. I was still sitting with that thought, the bread warm in my palms, when the door opened and King Theron walked in, alone, and the whole quality of the room changed the way it changes when someone very large and very present enters a very small space. He sat down across the table from me without ceremony, which surprised me. I had half risen from my seat, uncertain of the protocol, and he waved a hand briefly that seemed to mean sit down, so I sat. He looked, up close and in morning light, more human than he did at a distance. The scar along his jaw was older than I had thought. Years old, fully healed, pale against his dark skin. His braids were pulled back from his face with a leather cord, and several of them had come loose during the morning's confrontation and hung forward, which he ignored. The makeshift binding on his forearm was already seeping slightly at one edge. "That needs a proper healer," I said, before I could stop myself. He glanced at it. "It will. I can bind it better than that," I said, still apparently unable to stop. "If there is clean linen, the knot you've used will loosen when you move." He looked at me again with that assessing quality. "Can you?" he said. "I trained under the village healer in Fennec for 2 years before I came to Varnhold," I said. "I am better with wounds than with trays, honestly, but trays were what was needed." A silence. Then he reached across the table and set his arm flat on the wood, the bound wound facing up. "Show me," he said. "There is something deeply strange about holding the wrist of a king. Not strange in a frightening way, though there was that too. A low hum of awareness that I was touching someone whose word could alter the course of any life in this kingdom, including mine. Strange in a quieter way, a more honest way, because hands tell you things that faces are trained to hide, and King Theron's hands told me that he was tired in a way that sleep would not entirely fix, and that he had been carrying something heavy for a long time. I unwound the poorly tied cloth carefully, noting the tension in his forearm as I worked. Not from pain, but from the discipline of a man who does not permit himself to react to pain in front of others. The cut was clean, not deep, the kind that bleeds convincingly but heals quickly if treated properly. Sela had brought a small basket of healer's supplies when Corvin had asked. The East Solar kept a basic kit for exactly these situations, tucked in a chest beneath the window. And I had already sorted through it while waiting. Linen strips, a small clay pot of drawing salve that smelled of pine resin and yarrow, a square of pressed moss for the initial dressing. I worked without speaking for a moment, cleaning the wound with a damp cloth, applying the salve in a thin, even layer. My hands had steadied. They always did, when there was something specific to do. It was the waiting that undid me. "Fenwick," Theron said after a while. "That is 2 days' ride east of here." "Yes, my lord." "You came to Varenhold alone?" "With a letter of recommendation from the village elder," I said. "I was 22. The healer I trained under, Master Edric, said I had learned everything he could teach me, and that the castle would offer more. He was not wrong. The castle has offered a great deal." "Trays," Theron said. "Trays," I agreed. "And speaking tubes." The ghost of that almost smile returned. I felt it more than saw it. A slight shift in the quality of his silence. A fractional easing. "Why did they assign you to serving work?" he said. "If you came with a healer's training?" I tied off the bandage with a knot that would hold. A healer's knot, double-looped at the base so it would not tighten or loosen with movement. I smoothed the edge of the linen flat before I answered. "I am an Omega," I said simply. "The head healer at Varenhold is Beta. His 2 assistants are Beta. When I presented my letter, he reviewed it and said my training was adequate for a village setting and that the castle's needs were more complex." I picked up the remaining strips of linen and began folding them back into the basket, keeping my hands busy. He assigned me to the domestic staff. Lord Kale found me useful with the Eastern Wing because I was quiet, and I learned the layout quickly. A pause. "That is a waste," Theron said. It was almost exactly what I had said to him in the Great Hall. It seemed like a waste to know something useful and not use it. And I looked up at him then, because it startled me, and found him watching me with an expression I could not entirely read. Not pity. Something more useful than pity. "Many things in a castle are," I said, before I could think better of it. He did not look offended. He looked, if anything, like someone who had just confirmed a suspicion. "Tell me what you heard through the door," he said. "Before you moved to the tube, tell me exactly." So I told him. I repeated as precisely as I could the exchange I had heard. Pell's smoothness, Davin's hollow anger stripped of its performance, Mora's single quiet sentence about certainty, the specific phrasing about a signed agreement and trade terms. Theron listened without interrupting, his forearm still resting on the table, his pale eyes steady. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The agreement they mentioned," he said, "does not exist. There was a preliminary discussion 6 months ago that never became a document because Lord Hadrick withdrew his support before anything was formalized." He paused. "They invented the obligation. They were counting on the assertion of a signed document to create enough confusion, enough doubt in the garrison's mind, to buy time." "And if your own men hesitated," I said slowly, working through it. "Even for a moment." "A moment is enough," he said, "when 5 alphas and their retinues are in the room." I thought about Lord Hadrick, his tired face, his silence during the confrontation. "Lord Hadrick," I said. "Did he know?" When I was listening, he didn't speak, not once. Theron's expression shifted. Not surprise, more like confirmation. "He sent me a message 3 days ago," he said, "through a servant. Not his own servant, one of mine, who he approached quietly during the evening meal." He paused. It was vague, a warning without specifics. I did not know what he intended by it until this morning. "He was trying to warn you without betraying the others," I said. "Yes." Theron looked at me. "You read people quickly." "I serve trays," I said. "You learn to read people quickly, or you spill things on them." This time the smile actually arrived, brief, contained, more in his eyes than his mouth, but unmistakably real. And it changed his face in a way that surprised me. He looked younger, less like a monument and more like a person. It vanished as quickly as it had come. The 5 lords were kept in separate chambers for the rest of that day, while Theron's council convened. I heard the details in fragments, the way servants always hear things. A word from Sela, who had been sent to carry wine to the council chamber and caught the edge of an argument on her way out. A muttered exchange between 2 garrison guards who passed through the kitchen at dusk and didn't notice me refilling the bread baskets. The council was divided. The older members, advisors who had served Theron's father, favored a formal trial, with representatives from each of the 5 territories summoned to witness. The younger captains wanted the lords held indefinitely. Corvan, apparently, said very little, which Sela reported meant he was waiting for the king to decide before committing to a position. And through it all, one name kept appearing in the fragments I collected. Mine. Not prominently, not loudly, but with a persistence that made the back of my neck prickle. The Omega girl. Is she to be questioned by the council? Theron spoke with her already. Alone. An Omega serving girl, in conference with the king. She called the garrison. She was there. I kept my head down and restocked the bread baskets and said nothing, but I was aware, in a way I had not been that morning, that the invisible quality I had spent 3 years perfecting had been permanently altered. Something had been seen that could not be unseen. That night, Sela sat beside me at the long servants' table and nudged my arm. Lady Mora asked about you, she said quietly. By name. She asked Lord Cale who you were. I set down my spoon. What did Lord Cale say? That you were a domestic servant, an Omega, and had been with the castle 3 years. Selah paused. Lady Mora said, that is interesting, and did not ask anything else. She looked at me sideways. Annie, that woman doesn't say that is interesting about anything that doesn't matter to her. I picked up my spoon again. The stew had gone slightly cold. I expect it will be fine, I said. Selah gave me the look of someone who deeply doubts that something will be fine, but loves you too much to say so directly. The next morning, I was summoned. Not to the East Solar this time, to the King's map chamber, which was in the Upper West Tower, and which I had cleaned perhaps twice in 3 years, on days when the regular tower servant was unwell. It was a room I remembered clearly, circular, with stone walls covered in iron brackets holding rolled maps, a central table that was barely visible under the weight of parchment and charcoal markings, 2 narrow windows that looked north toward the mountain pass, and a single candelabra that was never allowed to go out. Theron was there when I arrived, standing at the table with Corvin and 2 council members I recognized but had never spoken to. He dismissed the council members when I entered, not curtly, but with finality, and Corvin remained. Sit, Theron said, nodding toward a stool near the table's edge. I sat. I have a proposal for you, he said, without preface. You are free to refuse it. I noticed that he said this, free to refuse, clearly, and without softening it, as though it mattered to him that I understood it was a genuine option. The castle's intelligence has a weakness, he said. He moved around the table as he spoke, not restlessly, but the way a man moves when his thoughts are moving with him. I have advisors, captains, nobles. What I do not have is someone who moves through every level of this castle unnoticed and knows its physical structure the way a healer knows a body. Every channel, every connection, every place where something travels faster than it should. He stopped and looked at me. You know the speaking tubes, all of them, you said. Yes, my lord. Do you know the castle's other structures? Passage connections, supply routes, which corridors share walls, which chambers are adjacent, which rooms have been sealed, and which only appear sealed. I thought about it carefully. 3 years of carrying trays and cleaning grates, and mapping my route through the castle's bones. Most of them, I said honestly. There are sections of the lower north wing I have not entered, and the old keep below the garrison, I have never been permitted there. Would you be willing to learn the rest? I looked at him, then at Corvin, whose expression was carefully neutral in the way of a man who has already heard the plan and is now observing how someone else receives it. What exactly are you proposing, my lord? I asked. Theron rested both hands flat on the map table. I want you to formally join the castle's intelligence network, he said. Not as a servant, as a trained operative, with access to sections of this castle currently restricted, knowledge of its communication systems, and the authority to act on your own judgment in situations, like yesterday's, where waiting for instruction is not an option. He paused. Your Omega status would remain your cover, as it has always been. No one would know your role had changed. The room was very quiet. I thought about Lord Pell's voice saying an Omega serving girl with that razor-edged contempt. I thought about the head healer reviewing my letter from Master Edric and assigning me to carry trays. I thought about 3 years of perfecting invisibility as a survival strategy and learning, quite accidentally, that invisibility was also something else. It was a weapon. You said I could refuse, I said. You can, Theron said. What happens if I refuse? You return to your duties in the Eastern Wing, he said without hesitation. With my gratitude, which is genuine, and no consequence whatsoever for declining. I believed him. I was not entirely sure why, but I believed him. I have a condition, I said. Corvin's eyebrow moved a fraction. Theron simply waited. I want to work under the head healer as well, I said. Not instead of the intelligence work. Alongside it. My training shouldn't be wasted. You said so yourself. A pause. Agreed, Theron said. Then I accept, I said. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, and I had not lived a simple life. By day, I carried trays. I cleaned grates. I moved through the corridors of Castle Varenhold in my gray cloak with my blonde braid over one shoulder and my eyes cast at the appropriate angle, and I was exactly what I had always appeared to be, an Omega domestic servant, unremarkable, unnoticed, belonging to the furniture of the castle, the way the stone benches and the iron torch brackets belonged to it. Lord Cale gave me my assignments each morning. I completed them without complaint. And while I completed them, I listened. I had not fully understood, until Theron named it plainly in the map chamber, how much I had already been doing without a name for it. The speaking tubes were only the most obvious version of a skill I had been practicing for 3 years, without recognizing it as a skill. I knew which lord's servants talked freely in the kitchen. I knew which garrison guards' voices carried down certain stairwells. I knew that the wall between the Great Hall's antechamber and the small prayer room was thin enough that a conversation held at normal volume on one side was perfectly audible on the other, and I had cleaned that prayer room every 3rd day for 2 years. Corvin met with me every 4th evening in the lower servants' hall after the kitchen had been cleared, a meeting that looked, to anyone who observed it, like the garrison captain making his routine check of the domestic roster. He was a practical man. He wasted no words. He asked me what I had heard, I told him, and he wrote nothing down because nothing written could be found. He also taught me things. Not fighting. That was not what my role required, and we were both practical enough to know it. But other things. How to recognize when a man is lying by the rhythm of his breathing. How to move through a crowded room so that the eye slides past you. How to remember a long conversation verbatim by anchoring each piece of it to a physical sensation. The weight of a pitcher, the temperature of a stone wall, the smell of a particular hallway. My mind, he told me one evening, with the mild approval of a man not given to praise, was better suited to this work than most of the trained operatives he had encountered. Most trained operatives, he said, are alphas. They are trained to project presence. Your entire life has trained you to suppress it. That is considerably more useful. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The 5 lords were dealt with in the way that Theron's council eventually agreed upon, which was quietly and without the kind of public spectacle that would have forced the 5 territories into defensive postures. Lord Hadrick was released first, and without charge. The warning he had sent, vague as it was treated as a gesture of good faith. I heard, through Sella, that he had met privately with Theron for nearly 2 hours before his departure, and that he had left looking older, but somehow lighter, as though he had set something down. Lords Davon and Siren were sent back to their territories under formal censure. Their armies reduced by treaty. Their trade privileges suspended for 5 years. Their eldest heirs required to spend a season at Varenhold, under what was diplomatically called educational placement, and what everyone understood to be something else. A soft leash. Visible and not entirely comfortable, but not humiliating enough to breed the kind of resentment that turns into the next generation's conspiracy. Lord Pell was a more complex matter. He was young, and young men with ambition and wounded pride are not predictable. The council argued about him for 3 days. I heard fragments of it through the antechamber wall, and I reported those fragments to Corvin, who reported them to Theron, who made his decision on the morning of the 4th day. Pell was offered a choice: formal exile with his title intact, or a role within Varenhold's own council structure, junior, supervised, stripped of independent military command, but present. A voice without teeth, at least for now. The logic, as I understood it, was that a man kept close can be watched, and a man in exile can build armies you cannot see. Pell chose to stay. I was not certain it was the right choice, Theron's or Pell's, but it was not my decision to make. What I noticed was that Pell, in the days following his reinstatement to the council in his diminished capacity, began paying a particular kind of attention to the servants around him. His eyes moved differently. He was looking for something. I told Corvin. He suspects there was an informant, Corvin said. He heard Theron say he knew things about the walls, I said. He's trying to find the source. Corvin considered this. Keep your distance from him when possible. Do not alter your behavior in any way that could be noticed. Continue. I continued. Lady Mora left Varenhold a fortnight after the failed coup, as she had always planned to. Her territory required her return, and her pride did not particularly need nursing, which I had come to understand, was because Lady Mora had built her reputation on setbacks as much as victories. She had miscalculated, and she knew it. And she treated the knowledge the way she seemed to treat most things, as information to be filed and used later. The morning she departed, she passed through the eastern corridor, where I was sweeping the hearthstone outside the guest wing. She stopped. I kept sweeping. Girl, she said. I looked up, met her eyes, dark gray, steady, with the particular sharpness of someone who has spent a lifetime looking at things more carefully than other people look at them. You have a useful face, she said. It says nothing. Thank you, my lady, I said. It was not precisely a compliment. She studied me for a moment longer. In the Crestfall, women like you are called still water, the kind that looks shallow and runs very deep. She paused. The phrase is not a criticism there, either. She walked on. I stared at the hearthstone for a moment, then resumed sweeping. Still water. I turned the phrase over in my mind the way you turn a smooth stone over in your hand, feeling its weight and its edges. I thought I might keep it. It was on a night in late autumn, 6 weeks after the failed coup, that the thing happened that I had not prepared for. I had gone to the map chamber at Theron's summons. Not unusual now. It had become a regular occurrence, these evening meetings, to review what I had gathered and plan the next week's movements. Corvin was usually present. That night, he was not. He had been called to the outer gate on some garrison matter, and the message summoning me had already been sent before his departure, so I arrived to find the room with only one candelabra lit and only one person in it. Theron was standing at the north window, looking out at the mountain pass in the darkness. He did not turn when I entered, which was unusual. He was generally precise about acknowledging people's arrivals, the way men who command others learn to be, so that people know their presence registers. My lord, I said. Sit, he said. Or stand. It does not matter. I stood, because something in his stillness made sitting feel wrong. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but the pass showed as a deeper darkness between two ridges, and somewhere beyond it, 2 days' hard ride, was the nearest border of Lord Pell's territory of Dunmarch. I had been studying the maps for 6 weeks. I knew the geography of this kingdom in a way I had never known it when I was only carrying trays. There is a report, Theron said, still looking north, from a border rider, 3 days old, which is how long it took to reach me through the autumn roads. He paused. Lord Pell's younger brother has been gathering men, quietly, in the eastern reaches of Dunmarch, near the Greyvale border, near enough that it could be read as a response to Lord Hadrick's presence, if anyone chose to read it that way. And if it isn't, I said. Then it is preparation, he said, for something Pell intends to finish from inside, while his brother prepares outside. He was quiet for a moment. He has not been careless enough to give us anything direct. Every conversation I have received reports on has been exactly what it appears to be, a junior council member learning his role. I know, I said. He turned then. You've been watching him. You asked me to watch everyone, I said. He is part of everyone. What have you found? I had been arranging this in my mind for 3 days, waiting for the right moment. I moved to the map table and found the relevant parchment, the rough sketch of Varenhold's interior that Corvin and I had been annotating over the past weeks, and pointed to a small room marked in the lower east wing. "The old records room," I said. "It hasn't been used as a records room in 20 years. The documents were moved to the council archive when the new wing was built. The room has been empty since." I looked at Theron. "Lord Pell has visited it 4 times in the past 2 weeks, each time between the 3rd and 4th bell of the evening, when the East Wing guards rotate, and there is a gap of approximately 10 minutes in the corridor watch." Theron looked at the map, then at me. "How do you know this?" "Because the speaking tube that serves the old records room runs adjacent to the one in the linen storage 2 floors above," I said. "When the lower tube is opened, there is a secondary grate inside the records room, not obvious, behind a shelf bracket. It creates a draft in the upper tube that I can feel if my hand is near the grate." I paused. I began checking the upper tube during my evening rounds after I noticed Lord Pell moving toward the east wing on the second occasion. A silence. "He's been communicating through the tube," Theron said slowly. "I believe so. The tube doesn't run to any room I can identify. It terminates in a section of the lower north wing, near the old keep. The area you mentioned I had not accessed yet." I met his eyes. "I think there's someone on the other end." The candelabra flame moved in a draft from somewhere, sending shadows briefly sideways across his face. "The lower north wing," he said, "has been sealed for 11 years. Officially." "Officially," I agreed. He looked at me for a long moment. Not with the assessing quality I'd grown used to. This was different. This was something closer to what I could only describe as recognition. The particular way a person looks at someone when they realize the shape of what they are dealing with, and find it larger than they expected. "Annie," he said. It was the first time he had used my name without the girl before it, or the servant after it. Something shifted in the room's temperature. Not colder, but more present. "How long?" he said quietly. "Has someone been using the passages of my castle without my knowledge?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but I intend to find out." He nodded slowly. Then he did something that surprised me entirely. He pulled the second stool from beneath the table's edge and set it on his side of the table, close to where he was standing, rather than across from him. "Then sit," he said, "and tell me everything you know about the lower north wing." I crossed the room. I sat. And for the first time in 3 years of carrying trays through Castle Varenhold, I felt, not safe exactly, because the situation was not safe, but placed. Like a thing that has finally been set on the shelf it was made for. Outside the window, the mountain pass was dark and silent, but I was listening. The door to the lower north wing had been sealed with iron bolts and a wax seal bearing the crest of Theron's father. I stood before it in the pre-dawn darkness of the following morning, a single oil lamp in my hand, Corvin to my left and 2 of the garrison's most trusted men behind us. Theron stood beside me. He had insisted on coming himself, which had produced a brief and quietly intense exchange with Corvin about the wisdom of the king entering an unsecured passage, and which had ended the way most exchanges with Theron appeared to end. With Theron doing what he had decided to do, and Corvin accepting it with the resigned competence of a man who has long since stopped being surprised. The wax seal was broken. Not recently. The break was old, the edges yellowed, pressed back into approximate position with enough care to pass a casual inspection. Someone had been through this door many times, and had been very careful about concealing it. Corvin examined the break with his torch, said nothing. Looked at Theron. Theron looked at me. "You first," he said. "You know the layout." I did not know the layout of the lower north wing. I had said so clearly. What I knew was the speaking tube terminus, which I had located that morning by following the tube's path through the walls using the draft method I had described to Theron, feeling for the movement of air at each junction, tracing it downward through the castle's bones, the way you trace a river to its source. What I had found was not a room. It was a network. The lower north wing was not empty. It was not full of people, not exactly, but it was full of evidence of people, which in some ways is more revealing because people can compose their expressions and moderate their words, but the things they leave behind tell the truth. There were sleeping pallets, 4 of them, recently used, the straw still shaped to bodies, the rough blankets carrying warmth when I pressed my hand to them. There were food stores, hard bread, dried meat, a clay jug of water. There were weapons, not many, but well maintained, the kind of maintenance that speaks of professionals rather than opportunists. And there were documents, not many. Whoever had been here was careful, but careful is not the same as perfect, and in their haste to leave, because they had left recently, the pallets warm and a half-eaten heel of bread on the floor near the door, suggesting a departure that was faster than planned. They had missed one. It had fallen behind a loose stone in the wall's base, invisible unless you were kneeling on the floor, with a lamp held low. Which I was, because I had been following the speaking tube's final run along the floor's edge and had happened to notice the paper's corner catching the light. I pulled it free and read it. Then I stood up and handed it to Theron without a word, because some things are better given directly than described. He read it. His face did not change, not visibly, but I had spent 6 weeks learning to read the things his face did not do, and what it did not do was what told me everything. It was a letter in Lord Pell's hand. Partial. The top had been torn away, removing the date and salutation, which was deliberate. But what remained was enough. It referenced a second attempt. It referenced the lower passages. It referenced, in language careful enough to be deniable, but specific enough to be unmistakable, the removal of the Alpha King before the winter solstice, which was 18 days away. And it referenced payment, a significant amount. Enough to suggest the 4 sleeping pallets had not belonged to Lord Pell's men alone. Hired swords, Corvin said, reading over Theron's shoulder. From outside the territories, Theron said. None of the 5 Lord's men. Too visible, too traceable. He hired external. He folded the letter. He planned this before he accepted the offer to remain on the council. He accepted the offer specifically to be inside the walls when it happened. I had known this, or suspected it, for 2 weeks. Hearing it confirmed aloud felt like a cold stone settling in my stomach. The 4 men on the pallets, I said. They left quickly. Someone warned them. Corvin turned to his 2 garrison men immediately, sending them with quiet urgency to seal the wing's other exits. There were 3. I had identified them in my map work, and I described their locations precisely while Corvin's men memorized and moved. Whether the hired men were still within the castle's outer walls was uncertain. Whether they could be caught before they disappeared into the forest roads was more uncertain still. But what was certain, what stood in the middle of the lower north wing with a lamp and a folded letter, and the particular stillness of a man recalibrating, was Theron. I watched him think. I had learned, over 6 weeks, what it looked like when he was deciding something significant, versus when he was processing information, versus when he was managing a reaction he did not intend to show. This was all 3 at once, layered, and underneath all of them was something I had not seen on him before. Not fear. Theron was not afraid of Lord Pell or the hired men or the plot itself. What I saw, in the careful set of his jaw and the way his eyes moved briefly to the sealed door we had come through, was something quieter and more painful. He had offered Pell a choice. He had kept him close, offered him a voice, extended the kind of trust that costs something to give. And Pell had taken it and built a hiding place beneath the floor. "My lord," I said quietly. He looked at me. "It was the right decision," I said. "Keeping him. You could not have known he had already set this in motion. A man who would have chosen exile would have built this from outside instead of inside, and you would not have found the letter." A pause. "You are telling me," he said, "that the situation revealing the trap is itself the reason the trap failed." "I am telling you," I said, "that you were not wrong to offer a man a chance. What he did with it is his accounting, not yours. Corvin was quiet behind us, professionally absorbed in examining the weapon cache, which was almost certainly his way of giving us the room. Theron looked at me for a long moment. The lamp between us threw unsteady light across his face, warming the dark angles of it, catching the pale blue of his eyes. "You do that," he said. "Do what, my lord?" "Locate the thing a person actually needs to hear," he said, "and say it. Not the comforting version, the accurate version." He paused. "Most people, when they speak to me, are either telling me what they think I want or protecting themselves from what they think I'll do. You do neither." I thought about that. "I spent 3 years invisible," I said. "You learn, when no one is watching, to be honest. There is no audience to perform for." Something moved in his expression, deep and briefly unguarded, and then carefully returned to its usual composure. But I had seen it. The same loneliness I had felt in his hands when I bound his wound. The particular isolation of a person who has authority over everyone around them, and genuine closeness with no one. "Theron," he said. I blinked. "When we are not in the Great Hall or the Council Chamber," he said, "you may use my name. I would prefer it. I absorbed this." "Theron," I said carefully, testing the shape of it. He nodded once, as though it were settled. Lord Pell was arrested before the midday bell. He did not make a scene, which surprised some members of the council, and surprised me not at all. Pell was the kind of man who understood when a hand had been played out, and he understood it now. The letter, the empty pallets, the sealed wing opened and examined. He walked with the garrison guards with his chin raised and his expression composed, and only his eyes showed the calculation still running behind them, adding and subtracting, looking for a remaining move. There was none. Corvin had been thorough. 2 of the 4 hired men were caught at the eastern gate before dawn, attempting to leave with a merchant's supply cart. The other 2 reached the forest road and were not recovered, a fact that Corvin noted in his report with professional displeasure, and that Theron accepted with the acknowledgement that some things are incomplete, and incompleteness is not failure. The remaining lords, Devon and Saren, still under their formal censure, still with their eldest heirs in residence, received the news of Pell's second plot in ways that told me everything about them. Davin went silent and pale in a way that suggested he had not known, and was now performing rapid calculations about his own proximity to Pell's actions. Saren simply said, with the quiet precision that was his most consistent characteristic, "I expected something like this. Not this exactly. Something." Lord Hadrick, reached by messenger at his territory's border, sent back a response that was 2 sentences long. "I am relieved. I am sorry I was not braver sooner. I heard this through Sella, who heard it from one of the council scribes, and I held it for a moment before letting it go. Hadrick had done what he could, when he could bring himself to do it. That was worth something." The winter solstice came 18 days later, as it always did, indifferent to the plots that had been built around its date. The Great Hall was decorated for the solstice feast in the way it was decorated every year. Pine boughs along the high rafters, candles in the iron chandeliers, the long tables laid with the castle's best linen. The servants worked through the afternoon, and I worked with them, because my role had not changed in its surface appearance, and I did not want it to. This was the part that some people, Sala primarily, who had become the keeper of my secrets by proximity and loyalty, and her own irrepressible curiosity, did not entirely understand. Why, she asked, would I want to remain invisible now? Hadn't I earned something more visible? "I have something more useful than visible," I told her. She considered this while folding a tablecloth. "That is very wise, and also very frustrating," she said. "I wanted to see someone make a fuss over you." I laughed. It surprised me. The ease of it, the warmth. I had not laughed easily in a long time. "Selah," I said, "when this is over, when the Pell situation is fully resolved and the winter passes, I am to begin formally assisting the head healer. Theron has ordered it. The head healer has been told it is not optional. Sella put down the tablecloth. He ordered it, she said. He did. Because you asked him to. I made it a condition of my agreement, I said. She stared at me for a long moment, with an expression I could not entirely categorize. Something between delight and the particular satisfaction of a person watching a story land where it should. Annie, she said, you negotiated with the Alpha King. I asked for something reasonable, I said. He is a reasonable man. She picked up the tablecloth again, shaking her head slowly. Still water, she said, to no one in particular. Runs very deep. The solstice feast was loud and warm, and full of the particular relief of a castle that has survived something and is allowing itself for one evening to feel it. I moved through it in my gray cloak, refilling wine cups, carrying platters, watching. Theron sat at the high table, flanked by Corvin and the senior council members. His dark braids bound back with a cord of deep blue that was the only concession to ceremony he appeared to permit himself. He did not look like a man celebrating. He looked like a man who was present, which for him seemed to be the highest available form of relaxation. He caught my eye once, across the length of the hall. I did not look away first. Neither did he. It was not a long moment. It was a specific one, the kind that does not announce itself, but stays with you afterward, because something in it has the weight of a decision made quietly, without witnesses, without words. I moved on with my tray. 3 months after the solstice, Lord Pell was formally tried before a council of the remaining lords, including Lady Mora, who had returned from the Crestfall for the proceedings and who sat through them with the expression of a woman filing things away for future reference. He was exiled. Not quietly this time. Formally, publicly, stripped of his title and his territory, which was placed under a regent council until his eldest nephew came of age. He left Varenhold on a gray morning in early spring with fewer men than he had arrived with, and no expression at all on his face, which was its own kind of admission. I watched him go from the eastern corridor window. My window, my corridor. 3 years of trays and speaking tubes and cold stone under my palms. He did not look up. Spring came to Varenhold the way it always came to the mountains. Suddenly, without apology, snow receding from the castle's outer walls in a matter of days, the inner yard going from frost to mud to the first difficult green of new grass in what felt like a single breath. I was in the healer's wing when Theron found me. I had been there every morning for 6 weeks by then, working alongside the assistant healer, a young beta woman named Petra, who had initially regarded me with professional suspicion, and had recently begun asking my opinion on treatment plans, which felt like the best kind of progress. The head healer himself maintained a careful neutrality that was its own grudging form of acceptance. Theron came alone, without Corvan, which was unusual enough that Petra excused herself with remarkable speed, her professional neutrality briefly overridden by the universal human instinct to not be present when a king wishes to speak privately to someone. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at me, at my hands, which were sorting dried herbs into clay pots, at the healer's apron I had begun wearing over my gray cloak, at whatever my face was doing. "You look different," he said. "I am different," I said. 6 weeks of doing work I was trained for tends to have that effect. He stepped fully into the room. The morning light from the healer's wide southern window, the best light in the castle, because healers required it, fell across him and made him look, briefly, like the person behind the king rather than the king himself. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. I set down the herbs, turned to face him properly. "The council has recommended," he said, "that the position of Castle Intelligence Coordinator be formally created. An official role, with rank and authority, and a seat at the relevant table when intelligence matters are discussed." He paused. "The recommendation specifies that the role should be filled by whoever currently performs those functions." I looked at him steadily. That is a very indirect way, I said, of offering me a position. I wanted to give you the opportunity to refuse the indirect version before I asked you directly, he said. That is also very indirect. The corner of his mouth moved. Annie. Yes. Will you take the role? I thought about the speaking tubes, about the cold stone walls and the dust in the grates and the 3 years of trays, about the lower north wing and the warm pallets and the folded letter behind the loose stone, about Sella saying still water runs very deep, and Lady Mora's sharp gray eyes, and Corvan's professional approval, and the specific quality of Theron's silence when he was listening. About the night in the map chamber, the second stool pulled close. My name said simply and without title for the first time. Yes, I said. On one condition. He waited. The healer's work stays, I said. I will not choose between them. I know, he said. I built it into the proposal. I nodded slowly. Then, because there was something else. Something that had been living in the space between us for months, patient and specific, growing in the way of things that are not spoken, but are also not nothing. Theron, I said. Annie, he said. I would like to know, I said carefully, whether what you are offering is only a position. The room was very still. He crossed the distance between us, not quickly, not with the overwhelming momentum of an alpha demonstrating power, but steadily, deliberately, the way he made all his decisions. And when he stopped, he was close enough that I could see the faint scar along his jaw and the pale silver blue of his eyes in the morning light. It is not only a position, he said. I had known that. I had known it for some time. The way you know things that live in the body before they live in words. But there is a difference between knowing and hearing it, plainly, without diplomatic indirection, in his voice that was like the lowest string of a war drum, settled something in my chest that I had not known was unsettled. All right, I said. He reached out and took my hand, not dramatically, not as a gesture with an audience, but simply, the way you hold something you are certain of. His palm was warm against mine. We stood in the healer's window light, the spring yard visible below us, and neither of us said anything else for a while, because nothing else needed saying. That is where the story might seem to end, in a bright room, in spring, with a king's hand around mine. But the truth is, it ends differently, not in a single moment, but spread across the months and years that followed, in the small accumulated weight of a life properly lived. I held the position of intelligence coordinator for many years, and I learned the rest of the castle's hidden bones, and Corvan trained me until he was satisfied, which took longer than either of us expected, and produced a friendship I had not anticipated and valued more than I could easily say. Sella was eventually promoted to head the domestic staff, a position she was made for, and which she accepted with the specific combination of pleasure and exasperation that characterized everything she did. She also, 3 years after the events of the Autumn Council, married one of the garrison guards who had been quietly watching her for 2 years without managing to say so, and the wedding was held in the castle's great hall, and was the loudest event in the building's history. Petra became a skilled healer, and eventually took over from the head healer entirely. She stopped regarding me with professional suspicion around the time I correctly diagnosed a fever that she had misread, and after that, we were colleagues in the truest sense. Lady Mora returned to Vorenhold twice, once for political business, once for what she said was political business, and was, in fact, as far as I could tell, curiosity. She and I spoke directly on both occasions. She was always sharp and never easy, and I respected her completely. Lord Hadric lived out his remaining years in his territory, and sent occasional messages to Vorenhold that were addressed, with a specificity that meant something, to the king and his coordinator jointly. The 2 hired men who escaped into the forest roads were found 3 years later, working under false names in a trading town 2 territories east. Corvan handled it. I did not ask for details, and he did not offer them, and that was its own kind of partnership. As for Theron, He ruled Varenhold with the same quality that had made him capable of standing alone in a great hall full of armed men and not flinching. A combination of calculation and conviction that I came to understand, over time, was rarer than it appeared. He was not easy. He was not always right. There was a winter, 3 years in, when a decision he made regarding the border territories caused a conflict that took 6 months to resolve, and during those 6 months we argued with a directness that would have surprised anyone who had only ever seen the king at his formal distance. But he listened. That was the thing. He had always listened. Even in the great hall, standing alone, he had been listening. We were married in the autumn. In the great hall where the 5 lords had once held their swords and their plans, and their certainty that the world would arrange itself the way they required. The ceremony was not elaborate. Theron had no patience for elaboration, and I had spent enough years invisible that visibility for its own sake held no particular appeal. What I remember is this: the hall full of people who had become, without my entirely intending it, my people. Sella in the front with her garrison husband and her irrepressible expression. Corvin standing at the side with his arms crossed and his professional neutrality performing significant work. Petra with dried herb dust still on her apron because she had come directly from the healer's wing. And Theron, standing at the end of the hall, watching me walk toward him with an expression I had learned to read fluently. That quiet, complete attention that was the truest thing about him. The thing that had nothing to do with rank or alpha authority, and everything to do with who he was when the hall was empty. I walked to him. He took my hand. And in the high rafters above us, in the iron brackets and the stone channels that ran through the old walls like veins, the speaking tubes carried no messages that evening. They were simply there, patient, silent, present. Everything the castle needed to say, it had already said.